I was far from home, and the spell of the eastern sea was upon me. In the twilight, I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill, where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of the evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed on through the shallow, new-fallen snow, along the road that soared lonely up to where Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on toward the very ancient town I had never seen but had often dreamed of. And that was the opening of the festival by HP Lovecraft. It's a story that is appropriate for the season that we just finished. And for those of you who listen to my reading of this story, you'll understand that this is actually a Christmas story. This is also one of your favorites too, Ralph, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I would rank it in my top 3 Lovecraft stories. Yeah.
It's one of my favorites too. And I was telling you that though I do like all of Lovecraft's material, I'm partial to the shorter pieces like this.
Yes. It has Lovecraft also, he always gets attached to just the Cthulhu thing. And we talked about it before. I love this thing that Stephen King learned from Lovecraft to interconnect the stories, even though there are stories where no fish creatures appear, but that you have he also owned a copy of the hideous Necronomicon by Abdullah Hazred. And, you always have these connecting dots and lines. And I love that because it's building the universe of the whole thing. And I love it when the stories break out a bit. And to me, the best stories are the ones that trigger the true horror stuff that really shocks me. And I'm not shocked. I think there's not a Lovecraft story that shocks me, but it's the gloom in these stories that attracts me. And this story to me is one of his darkest and gloomiest ones.
Absolutely. And this was written in October 1923 and was first published in Weird Tales in the January 1925 issue. And, the Weird Tales, we talk about this quite a bit. That's the venue that a lot of these old school weird fiction writers published their material. Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft. They've all appeared in the pages of Weird Tales. And actually, there's a new version of this magazine that's out right now. They still publish it. They reawakened the beast. And I have the last several issues, and they've all been really good. So I highly recommend everyone checking it out.
So is it like a magazine format?
Yeah. It's a hard copy magazine.
Nice.
It's got cool artwork on the cover. This last, well, I don't know if it's the last issue, but the one, they have a heroic fantasy issue that there's a piece by Neil Gaiman. There's an excerpt from the new Elric book, which just came out by Michael Moorcock. And then there's just a bunch of other dark fantasy poems and short stories and things like that in there by various writers.
Fantastic.
But most of the other issues are focused on horror and weird tales. So it's pretty cool.
See, we spoke about that on our Schwarzenegger episode. This all drains my wallet really hard.
Dude, there's so much great stuff out there, especially if you're a reader, and I think this genre is in a bit of a renaissance over the last few years. You mentioned Adam Neville has a new short story, and he's another favorite of ours, and he's carrying the torch for weird fiction and folk horror, things like that.
Yep.
This story was inspired by Lovecraft's first trip to Marblehead, Massachusetts, and that's I believe on the North Shore, the quote unquote North Shore in the Boston area. And
Yep.
yeah, it's pretty sleepy little town. I know some people that are from Marblehead. I've actually been there. Oh, can you hold 1 second? I have a delivery here. I got to edit this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I ordered a proper espresso maker. Just showed up.
I just thought like, wow, that delivery of the book was fast.
Yeah, dude. It showed up like 20 minutes later.
Yeah.
All right. So the story.
We were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So it's Marblehead, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
All right. So, yeah, Lovecraft was very much impressed by Marblehead, and he referred to it as the most powerful single emotional climax experienced during my nearly 40 years of existence. I can't say that I share the
crazy.
same experience of going to Marblehead as he did, but you know. But yeah, there's a lot of places that show up in the short story. In the short story, it's called Kingsport. That's the the goal that the nameless narrator. That's the town that he visits, and there's a house and with an overhanging second floor, and that's Marblehead's 1 Mugford Street. And the church referred to in the story is St. Michael's Episcopal Church. And yeah, so there's a lot of actual, places that really exist in our world that Lovecraft used in his story.
The cool thing is about the technology that we complain a lot about, like with now music being nothing special since it's all like available all the time. And we sometimes doing like the old man shtick where we like glorify like, oh, we had to order a record, had to wait for it forever, blah, 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 blah. But the technology nowadays, just for example, I've never been to Marblehead and probably will never go there. But I just, when prepared for the podcast here, I reread the story, checked the same notes that you have on the internet, and then I used Google Earth to take a stroll through town and actually look at the places. This is fucking fantastic.
Yeah, Massachusetts has a lot of like that. New England in general, like along the coast.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these kind of cities which you can imagine would impress Lovecraft to write about. There's also some references to other books. There's the race that appears in here, this pre-Aryan sorceress race, would have appeared in Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult of Western Europe, a book that I've actually read, believe it or not. I have it in my bookshelf.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, of course, Arthur Machen, who was an influence on Lovecraft, he has a novel called The Three Impostors, and I have not read that. So that's apparently an influence on this short story.
That's I mean, that's the best way you can do it, like with King or probably Adam Neville. Adam Neville is always posting like stuff on his Instagram that he has read and like how much he's like, oh, I'm impressed with this. And then you read his stories and you're like, oh, cool. So like he definitely also takes influence from other authors. And that's what Lovecraft did too. And I think that's the cool thing about literature and writing, that the same with like us quoting musicians when we write music. We don't blatantly steal, but we're certainly influenced by it. And I like this, that there's this cultural narrative throughout time that we're involved by stuff that someone did before us, and we make our own take of it.
In the case of Lovecraft, there's a lot less for him to draw influence from. Because if you
Yeah.
think about it, it's like, okay, Robert Chambers, Lord Dunsany, Edgar Allan Poe,
Poe. Yeah.
Arthur Machen. Really, that's, I'm sure there are
Yeah.
others in there. I mean, Mary Shelley wrote some weird tales, from the early 1800s. I'm sure, Lovecraft was into that as well, you know.
Yeah, but the thing is, like these, it's kind of like when you compare it to metal, it's the same thing, that when you had heavy metal, and then Venom came, and Bathory came, and Hellhammer came, and pushed the boundaries, and that to other people heard that, and then they pushed the boundaries even further, creating like the second wave of black metal, and then you saw where it all comes down to today, and the horror that we have nowadays, the various forms, it's based on some people that like started the whole game, and others like pushing the door open, like Poe in his time, and then Lovecraft after that, and then people like King. And now you have all these various strains of horror literature, the same that we have with metal. It's not all of it is good, but it's there, and the people are creative. And yeah, so that's why Lovecraft is legitimately one of the forefathers of modern horror.
So the story starts, as we see in the excerpt read at the beginning of this episode, on Yuletide, which this unnamed narrator refers to as a time that men call Christmas. And so right away, you have the sense that the narrator is an outsider that doesn't necessarily exist within the confines of modern society for the time. Like, he's referring to a culture that precedes his current culture back into the deep past.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentions that this tradition is older than Bethlehem, Babylon, and Memphis, which are ancient cities that thousands of years ago. This predates all of that stuff. And he's traveling to Kingsport, and he's going to check in on some family that he has up there. And just his description of Kingsport, aside from the nods to Marblehead, it's that typical dark, deserted city that Lovecraft likes to have in all of his stories, or in a lot of his stories, I should
Correct.
say.
Yeah, the Innsmouth, Dunwich, and all these places. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the movie The Deep House?
Is the Deep House with the house underwater?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
Not almost a good movie, almost.
Yeah.
As Mick Jagger's son is in it. He's turned stars in that film. But one of the things I liked about that movie is the way that the town is kind of presented. It has like that deserted sort of vibe to it. You know what I mean? And immediately made me think of like Lovecraft, and even Thomas Ligotti presents towns the same way, as these kind of brooding, deserted places, these almost liminal spaces that exist between the future and the past in some ways. And that's the sense that I got of Kingsport.
Yeah, and it's also in that movie, the house is underwater, and it looks so gloomy. And that's what I meant with this story being one of its darkest. It's like from the get-go, when the narrator enters town, it doesn't feel that he's going to like a Christmas celebration, Like we all know, like movies like Home Alone and all the Christmas flicks, where families like travel through the country to come home to a joyful house full of people, and everybody's happy, or planes, trains, and automobiles and stuff like this for Thanksgiving. But this, from the get-go, man, this guy is entering the town and is like one of the, like, from what I imagine in my head, one of the bleakest, darkest, uncomfortable cities that you can think of. And he's also not seemingly like, oh yeah, I'm going to see some relatives for a Yuletide party, but it's all so depressing from the get-go.
Yeah, it has like this foreboding atmosphere to it, and then he comes upon the house that he's looking for, and he knocks on the door, and his what you're thinking is a family member lets him in, and they have these flabby hands and this kind of expressionless faces and things like that. But we discover that they're wearing masks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like, once again, adds another sheen of weirdness to this whole experience. Now,
And
can you imagine that? Like, you're visiting some relative and they're wearing a mask.
yeah.
And you go to this town that it seems like he's never been there before.
Dude, that's what I just wanted to say, man. It's just like I'm obsessed with masks. That's like, I mean, look at the cover of the last Ultha record. It's the whole thing about like the roles that we play and the masks that we wear is something that, like, on a philosophical level totally gets me. And that's why I always liked horror movies where villains had like masks on. For example, there's this movie The Strangers. I didn't really like that movie, but like the main villain that had like this sack over his head who looked kind of like a scarecrow, instantaneously like got me. Like just the visible thing, like the Michael Myers thing, that you wear a mask and you can't see what's actually going on, and the imagination coming in there. And like, again, like if you transfer it to real life, imagine your grandparents. We've all met our like most of us have met their grandparents. Imagine you visit them and you haven't seen them in a while, and they sit there and their faces aren't moving, but they're talking to you. You must be freaked out, and you must actually see that. But in this weird setting of that story, he's kind of okay with that. He's just like, huh, something's off. They wear gloves of their flabby hands and they have these bland faces, and everything smells weird. And it's just like, I would run the fuck away.
Yeah, it also plays into that whole vibe of masks, and if any, all these stories we're reading, these are like, it's almost like this archetype. We did, Mask of the Red Death a while back.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing this story. That's something that is like a big theme just in this genre, is concealing your face or creating this other persona for yourself, or just like the obscuring things and hiding and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look at one of the most successful horror movies of 2022, the totally overrated Smile.
Oh
It's
God.
just like, yeah, how irritating. I mean, the idea of having someone smile and make and scare you, I think that FX perfected that. And like, if you look at the videos for Come to Daddy or Window Licker, and you always have his ugly ass face with a grin, that's more scary than the whole Smile movie together. But like, it's just someone overtly smiling that can creep you out. If the eyes and the mouth don't match, it's not congruent. And that's kind of the thing too with masks. It's just like, it's uncomfortable because you cannot see behind it.
Have you, what comes to mind too is, are you a fan of Eyes Wide Shut?
I haven't seen it, but I know you like it.
Well, the book that it's based on, it's
Mm-hmm.
called, what the hell is it called? 20th Century Dream Story by Arthur Schnitzler. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Arthur Schnitzler. It's only like 115 pages long or something like that, and it's kind of a weird tale. And it reminded
Mm-hmm.
some elements of this story. I mean, that story kind of reminds me of elements that are in the festival, because it's both stories take place on Christmas. You know what I mean? There's like, a meeting of people, masks, concealment. In the case of Lovecraft, it actually gets revealed what's actually, the sinister nature of everything. But in 21st Century Dream Story, it doesn't really go into that as much. It's kind of vague as to what actually happens at the end of the book.
Mm. It's just like that this theme with the weird assembly of people that end up being sort of like a cult, and them wearing masks, and you cannot really see what's going on, is a theme throughout like a lot of movies that I back and dig. For example, one of the movies that I really love is Ninth Gate,
Yeah.
which a lot of people hate on, but I love movie, and it also has that congregation when they have the book. Kill List come the end of Kill
Oh
List
man,
comes to mind.
yeah.
You know, like with the mask and everything, and it's some a trope that always gets. It's kind of the same with black metal. If people have like a cool black and white like copied artwork on their tape with someone with a torch or a shovel or a sword and like a black and white face in the snow in the forest, I'll at least give it a shot, you know? And that's like the kind of horror that I dig. That's why this story in particular, more so than like the like Shadow over Innsmouth, which is also fantastic. But this one is way more up my alley because it has that element of like this weird masked people cult aspect to it.
And also, all the whole thing takes place over the course of a few hours. Really, the story is like
Yeah,
the chronological time frame is short. So he
yeah.
enters the house, and another tip off that there's some sinister stuff going on is they have a copy of a Latin translation of the Necronomicon,
Yeah.
which plays heavily in the Cthulhu mythos that Lovecraft
Yeah.
has created. So we know that
Yeah.
there's some sinister stuff going on here. We got people wearing masks. We got a copy of the Necronomicon, and it's some of the yellow writing of Lovecraft shines through. A
Hmm.
thought and a legend too hideous for sanity or consciousness. You gotta
Mm.
love that. That's how he refers to the Necronomicon. Yeah. So now at 11 o'clock, they take him to meet up with a crowd of people. They're wearing cloaks, and they also have masks on, and they head to the top of a hill at the center of town. And we mentioned how this mirrors the actual layout of Marblehead, and there's a
Yep.
church up there. That's the church in Marblehead too. And the crowd is led to this church.
And they enter, and yeah, it's like this congregation again. It's like this moment. The whole story feels like I think that like which comes to play here when he goes into that group and they go towards the church and then go into the crypt. I think that the dude is completely isolated and lonely. Like even with his like relatives, I think there's it's supposed to be his grandpa and his aunt. No, his uncle and aunt, right?
Yeah.
That's the people that he visits. I mean, she's working on that the garment thing, and they're like super weird and offering him stuff, and everything feels uncomfortable. And then they're like, okay, let's go. Then they go to this mass, and then like he arrives and it doesn't feel right. He goes into that house, it's even more wrong, and now he still follows them into this crowd because he's driven or supposed to do this without actually questioning like what the fuck am I doing here. This does, I mean, he must have like a man in his right mind would have said like this all feels so wrong, like I shouldn't be here.
Now, one of the interesting things about this church is that it's underneath the church. There's a passageway, okay,
Yeah.
that goes into another more ancient location. Now, this also is like a huge trope that we see recurring in a lot of these types of things. We have the Christianity overlaid on top of an ancient
Hmm.
belief system, and this is like a very very popular motif that it shows up in folk horror. If you think about like the Wicker Man and you mentioned Kill List. There's like,
Yeah.
if you think about just England in general, even though this takes place in New England. If you
Yeah.
think about England, the Romans brought Christianity to Britain, ancient Britain, and at that
Yeah.
point, the Roman Empire was the Holy Roman Empire. So the concept of Christianity came to this land, and they just kind of sat it on top of their old belief systems, like their old gods, their old ways.
Yeah.
And that's what this scenario in the book, the story rather, shows you, that this church is literally placed on top of what I'm perceiving as another hallowed ancient, location. You know what I mean? Like there's like this
Yes.
labyrinth below the church that
Yeah.
this is where we get some great writing here. A vast fungus shore litten by a belching column of sick greenish flame and washed by a wide, oily river that flowed from abysses, frightful and unsuspected. It's fucking brilliant, man. So underneath this church, there's like this secret river that comes from like this dark abyss, this void, and it's there's like strange plants and mushrooms growing everywhere, and there's like a whole ocean that's underneath the land. That's like this. It also comes to mind too is back in the between the 1800s and the 1900s, like the turn of the 20th century, there's a lot of ideas of like these inner Earth stories, like guys like Edgar Rice Burroughs, like he had like the Pellucidar books that he wrote.
Yep.
There's like this inner Earth fantasy stories that were coming up, and I think that Lovecraft kind of dips into this a little bit here.
Yeah, Jules Verne comes to mind,
Yep.
like the journey to the center of the earth. And what to me always comes to mind, and that's like connected to my favorite Lovecraft story is The Rats in the Wall. And it's the same thing that like underneath the house, there's these catacombs and you go down and further down. And to me, like it came up two things, like look at like how often basements are the center of fear in horror movies. You have it like in the beginning of It, when Georgie has to run down to the basement to get like the paraffin for the boat. You have it in Nightmare on Elm Street, where the boiler room is, where Freddy got torched. You got it in even in Kevin in Home Alone, like in that scene where he is alone and he has to run to the basement. There's the scary boiler. So the basement underneath the earth is where the dead are buried. So that's always scary. And also the idea of hell, like because Christians always say like when you're good and you die, you go to heaven. And the worst thing that can happen is you go down to hell, and hell is somewhere underneath the earth. And that's like whenever someone goes down and deeper, and that's the thing, a motif that is like done really well, I think, in As Above, So Below, the found footage horror film that I love so much. It's like the further you go down, the closer you get to hell. And that's kind of the feeling that I have here. When you go down that river, that path, it like you go closer to hell.
Yes, exactly. And these this cult is like worshipers of like this unclean sort of ideology, And so when we're in this labyrinth, we hear this weird flute music that's coming in, and they're engaging in what they're referring to as the Yuletide rite or the Yule rite. And once again,
older.
He talks about it being older than man. Okay, so here's the first
and fated to survive him.
Yeah. So here is where we get into the concept that these people are not altogether human, that there's some offshoot of an older race that existed prior to man inhabiting the planet.
Yeah.
So at this point, this horde of eyeless creatures, they reveal themselves, and it's kind of hard to visualize what they are because they have wings, but they live underground. He also likens them to ants, and vampire bats too. So I don't know. I had a hard time kind of figuring out what these things look like.
Yeah, but like imagine this. You go like, and this is what I love so much about the story. Your imagination can go buck wild there. So you go like, there's a church and there's an opening. You go to the crypt and you go deeper. All of a sudden there's a river. Everything is green lit, moldy, dark, and uncomfortable. You follow that river. All of a sudden you hear like a weird flute noise coming from something that you can't make out in the dark. and up until this point, it's like classic horror, so you don't know what happens. But then all of a sudden, these transport beings come up and take these people away. And that's like, at that point, you must lose your mind. And that's like, I mean, mostly like the descent into madness is like what kinds of drives the stories of Lovecraft. That's what we are like going towards with this story. But like, dude, in this moment, latest, I would have passed out and say like, okay, dude, like, what the fuck?
And you know, our narrator doesn't. You know, he kind of resists being pulled away into this dark, oily water abyss. So these
Yeah,
creatures are meant more to be like, um, you know, passage. Like they're like you're supposed to ride them into this
yeah.
black hole of, you know, darkness. And so the narrator jumps into the water, and rather than go on this you know, this like excursion into hell essentially, and then
Yeah,
he awakens in a hospital in Kingsport.
yeah. And then it's the question: was it all a dream? Yeah.
Because
I mean, before. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the town is different than what he remembers it too. Like the town is
Yeah.
not the same, you know, gloomy like ancient world. It's in like a more modern time when he looks out the window of the hospital.
Yeah. The point where like the question with the dream to me came up was before he jumps, like the moment that he that triggers him to jump into the water because he doesn't want to have none of that is when he says um that he sees like a guy with a mask like face and has resemblance to his family, and that mask is like slipping down, and he is having something like an artifact um, uh, with his family's yeah, like an arm that has been buried with his great grandfather in 1698. So like something that like maybe appeared on pictures of his families, or like there's this heirloom that like our family always kept, but it was buried with your great grandfather, and then disappears with one of these creatures you see under the earth, and then you say like, okay, this cannot be true. And I sometimes have like in my dreams have like things appear that have been gone for a while, or like stuff that reminds me of my grandpa or something. And yeah, that left me with this feeling that like that has been played up in like a lot of like the Lovecraft stories is like in the end, so was this a dream or was it not? So if you make a show out of it, probably the studio would want to have that in the end someone like looks at the camera and winks or something, that it's like, oh, the evil is still there, part two is coming up or something. But yeah, that's where we find our protagonist in the end, in a town, in a different town.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the other thing too about this whole dream sequence thing, it's like I mentioned that it was it made me think a little bit of that story, the novella, 21st Century Dream Story, where yeah, you know, it's Christmas time. There's a bunch of people in masks. Some dark stuff happens, and at the end, you're kind of left thinking that maybe this didn't really happen, you know? And because what they're saying is that they rescued him from the harbor of Kingsport, and that they think that he jumped off of a cliff. So that, you know, there's a this whole story is kind of thrown in doubt when
Yeah.
the hospital, you know, reports that back to him.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing that is like to me, which with what I like better than like, okay, here's the actual proof, or like it's ambiguous. You can make up your own mind, and you can say like, ooh, kind of like watching a horror film where like when there's a horror movie that really like sucks you in, that you're in the end you're like, oh, thank God it was just like a movie. Or like when you have a bad dream, it's just like, thank God it was just a dream. um, I think it would be terrible to have something like this and then people try to explain to you, yeah, we found out this and that, and this is the truth. I'd rather have it like kind of ominous, and that's kind of what the Weird Tales thing to me is.
So they send him over to Arkham to recover. and and sort of, you're led to believe that he needs some like emotional recovery, and they just happen to have a copy of the Necronomicon there.
Like every good household.
Yeah, I have one too.
Yeah.
So he reads a passage out of it that makes him believe that his family lineage goes back to this this ancient race of people that are not altogether human.
Yeah. See, great holes secretly are digged where earth pours out to surface, and things have learned to walk that ought to crawl. That's such a good ending.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing I just wanted to mention too is a lot of these writers back then were paid by the word. So when Lovecraft is writing the description about the narrator's grandfather, he's the great grandfather.
Yeah.
It's like gotta get that word count maximized.
Yeah. Arthur Monroe Spooner, blah, 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 and that's like a 10 column name. Also, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a nice little tale. I recommend reading this around Christmas every year. It's a fun, thing to get into. And Lovecraft didn't really give this story much. Like he kind of didn't really think too much of this one,
Yeah.
But that also could just be his self-deprecating nature too,
Right, and that's like with most of the stories. I mean, like every Lovecraft story that we covered on here, mostly it was like, I hate that story, and I wonder, like, I need to find out which one is like a story he was super proud of. I think Innsmouth he was proud of. No, wait, no, Innsmouth wasn't as well. Probably Mouth of Madness or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, but it's like he hated everything he did, and it's crazy. But yeah, like with a lot of geniuses, it's like their own work, they don't like it, but the world after them tells them how good they were.
Yeah. So the festival, definitely read that.
Listen to some ambient music to it.
Yeah, or you can listen to my reading of it.
Yeah, I think that's just like one of these stories that is like, it is so full of gloom, and then you have like a dark ambient record playing in the background, in the dark, reading it just with a bit of light. Perfect.
So yeah, we're going to be doing a lot more of these coming down the line, and yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is always. Yeah.